The heat inside Rowans Chapel was a living thing, thick and oppressive as original sin. It pressed against 12-year-old Josiah's skin like wet wool, made his threadbare shirt cling to the welt still raised across his back, and turned each breath into an act of deliberate will. The air tasted of melting tallow and human sweat, of old wood soaked through with decades of desperate prayers that had gone unanswered. August in Georgia was always merciless, but inside this chapel, mercy had never lived at all. Josiah stood in the choir box to the left of the altar, his bare feet planted on floorboards worn smooth by generations of shuffling steps. His throat burned raw from the morning's singing, each note scraping against tissue already bruised. The hymnal in his hands trembled despite his efforts to hold it steady, the pages yellowed and soft as skin from countless fingers turning them in worship or in fear or in that terrible place where the two became indistinguishable. Beside him, Samuel stood rigid as carved wood, 14 years old and ancient with knowledge no child should carry. His voice rose clear and pure into the chapel's rafters, a sound so beautiful it could make you forget that beauty and goodness were not the same thing at all. On Josiah's other side, young Thomas, barely 9, sang with his eyes fixed firmly on the hymnal, his split lip from last Sunday's correction still faintly purple. And beyond Thomas, Elijah stood silent today, his voice taken from him by whatever had happened 3 nights ago in the vestry, his eyes focused on something only he could see, something far beyond these walls. The 4 of them made up Reverend Cornelius Thatcher's choir, chosen for their voices and their availability, for the fact that they belonged to masters who considered it an honor to lend their property to God's work. Chosen because they were beautiful in that way that made certain men hungry, because they were small and afraid, because there was no one to hear them if they cried out in the darkness. The congregation sat in their pews like judgment made flesh, fanning themselves with folded papers and handkerchiefs. Mr. Barnabas Harrow occupied the front pew with his wife Constance and their 3 pale daughters. Behind them sat the Rutherfords, the Caldwells, the Ashbys, all the fine families of Mercy Creek Plantation and the surrounding lands, owners of cotton and human souls in equal measure, believers in the divine order that placed them above and others below. They sang along with the choir now, their voices confident and careless. Rock of ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee. The words rose toward the chapel's peaked ceiling, toward heaven itself, though Josiah had long since stopped believing heaven was listening to anything that happened in this place. At the altar, Reverend Thatcher's shadow fell across the white cloth like a stain that wouldn't wash clean. He was a large man, tall and broad-shouldered, with gray at the temples that made the congregation whisper about his distinguished appearance. His face was handsome in that peculiar southern way, strong jaw, clear eyes, a mouth that smiled easily and often. When he preached, his voice carried the weight of divine authority, rolling and powerful as thunder across summer fields. Josiah watched that shadow and remembered. He remembered hands that were soft because they'd never worked hard, never picked cotton or done anything more strenuous than turn Bible pages and grip young shoulders hard enough to bruise bone deep. He remembered a breath that smelled of whiskey hidden in the vestry cabinet, of peppermint meant to disguise it. He remembered words whispered close to his ear about righteousness and obedience, about the suffering that purified the soul. Last night returned to him in flashes that made his vision blur. The vestry after evening prayers. The single candle burning low. Thatcher's face, friendly at first, asking about the new hymn. Then the shift, subtle as a cloud crossing the moon, when the questions became something else entirely. When the hand on his shoulder became a grip. When discipline became something with no name at all. The Reverend had quoted scripture while he worked his righteousness. Something from Proverbs about sparing the rod. Josiah had learned not to cry out anymore, it only made things worse. So he'd stood there and taken it, had let his mind go somewhere else while his body remained and suffered what it had to suffer. Afterward, Thatcher had been kind again, almost gentle, and had told him what a good boy he was, how proud God must be of his obedience. Had given him a peppermint candy and sent him back to the slave quarters with instructions to practice for Sunday service. Had smiled that warm, paternal smile that made Josiah's stomach turn to water. Now, standing in the choir box with that same smile beaming down at them, Josiah felt the weight of the knife hidden beneath the altar cloth. He'd placed it there before dawn, when he'd been sent to light the candles. It was a kitchen knife, nothing special, taken from the cookhouse yesterday. The blade had caught candlelight when he'd positioned it, just a brief flash of silver that looked almost holy in the dimness. A prayer waiting to be answered. Josiah had learned many things in his 12 years, but the most important was this: there was no justice for boys like him, no earthly authority that would hear his complaint. Mr. Harrow thought Thatcher was a godly man bringing Christian virtue to the plantation. The law itself declared that Josiah was property, not person, that his word meant nothing against a white man's character. So the knife waited, hidden and patient, while the hymn continued. Let the water and the blood, from thy wounded side which flowed, be of sin the double cure. The irony wasn't lost on Josiah. Blood would flow before this day was done. Samuel's voice rose higher on the next verse, pure and clear as church bells, and Josiah joined him, letting his ruined throat produce a sound that hurt coming out but somehow still carried beauty. Young Thomas's child voice wavered slightly, and Josiah saw Thatcher's eyes flick toward the boy, saw the small frown that meant correction would come later. The congregation remained oblivious, fanning themselves and following along in their hymnals, thinking pure thoughts about pure things while four boys stood before them bearing witness to something no one wanted to see. Mrs. Constance Harrow's face was serene with spiritual satisfaction. They saw nothing. They knew nothing. Or perhaps they knew and chose not to see, chose the comfort of ignorance over the discomfort of truth. He thought about his mother, sold away to Virginia 6 months ago. He remembered her hands, rough from work but gentle on his face, remembered her voice singing him to sleep with old songs. Remembered her telling him to be strong, to survive. But she hadn't known about Reverend Thatcher. She hadn't known what form survival would demand of him here at Mercy Creek. The knife waited. He could feel it like a pulse in the air, a promise and a threat in equal measure. The hymn ended. The congregation settled into their seats with rustling fabric and creaking wood. The four choir boys remained standing, awaiting their cue to sit, awaiting permission to rest, awaiting whatever came next in this familiar terrible ritual. Reverend Thatcher stepped forward to the pulpit, his hands gripping the worn wood, his face radiant with what looked like genuine spiritual fervor. When his gaze landed on Josiah specifically, the Reverend's smile deepened, warm and promising, full of plans for later. Brothers and sisters, Thatcher began, his voice rolling out across the chapel like Moses addressing the multitudes, today we shall speak of obedience. Of submission to divine will. Of the righteousness that comes through accepting the order God Himself has established. The congregation leaned forward, ready to receive wisdom, ready to have their choices validated and their consciences soothed. We find in Scripture countless examples of those who suffered according to God's plan. Job, tested through tribulation. Abraham, willing to sacrifice his beloved son. The divine order is not for us to question but to uphold. When we discipline those in our care, when we instruct those who lack understanding, we do God's own work. Samuel's hand found Josiah's for just a moment, a brief squeeze of understanding, of shared knowledge. Then it was gone. Young Thomas's eyes were filled with tears and he blinked back furiously. Elijah remained somewhere far away, his face blank as empty pages. And Josiah stood there, 12 years old and ancient with accumulated trauma, and made his decision. Not rashly, but with the cold clarity that comes when all other options have been systematically eliminated. He would not endure another night in the vestry. He would not watch another boy broken by holy hands. He would survive it, if he survived at all, by reaching for that knife when the moment came. By teaching Reverend Cornelius Thatcher what it meant to be on the receiving end of discipline. The sermon thundered on, Thatcher's face flushed with fervor, his hands gripping the pulpit as though drawing strength directly from the wood itself. The congregation nodded along, affirmed in their beliefs, comfortable in their certainty. But Josiah heard something else beneath the preaching. He heard the whisper of a blade waiting in darkness. He heard his own heartbeat counting down to an ending. He heard the beginning of a hymn that would be sung in blood before this day was finished. The Reverend's shadow continued to stain the altar, dark and broad and inescapable. But beneath that shadow, silver glinted. And Josiah felt something like peace settle over him. Soon. Very soon now. The sermon would end, communion would be prepared, and he would be called forward to assist. And then the knife would sing its own hymn, would spill truth across sacred ground whether anyone wanted to see it or not. The heat pressed down. The candles guttered and smoked. The congregation believed. And four choir boys stood waiting, their voices already forming the shape of a scream that sounded like hallelujah, that tasted like blood, that promised an ending to something that should never have begun. If you're enjoying this descent into darkness, subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our macabre tales. The Reverend's voice rolled through the chapel like distant thunder, speaking of Abraham and Isaac, of faith tested through the willingness to sacrifice what was most beloved. Josiah heard the words, but they reached him as though from underwater, distorted and strange, losing their intended meaning and gaining something darker. His mind slipped backward despite his efforts to remain present, pulled into memory like a stone sinking through black water. 6 months ago, he had stood on an auction block in Richmond, Virginia, watching his mother's face as the bidders called out their prices. Her name was Ruth, and she had survived 28 years of bondage through a combination of silent endurance and fierce love for her son. That love had shone in her eyes even as the distance between them grew, even as different men purchased them for different purposes, even as she was loaded onto a wagon heading south while Josiah was chained to a coffin heading north toward Georgia. Her last words to him had been whispered in the chaos of separation: "Stay alive. Whatever it takes, stay alive." She had meant it as comfort, as instruction for survival, as the only gift she had left to give. But she hadn't known what staying alive would cost him at Mercy Creek. She hadn't known about Reverend Thatcher. The journey to the plantation had taken 3 weeks, Josiah chained to 12 other slaves, walking through red Georgia clay that caked on his bare feet and turned to cutting mud when it rained. Mr. Barnabas Harrow had purchased him specifically for the chapel, having heard from the auctioneer about the boy's voice, about how he'd sung spirituals in the slave quarters that made grown men weep. Harrow considered himself a progressive master, a Christian gentleman who saw to the spiritual education of his property. He had paid top dollar for a choir boy. Upon arrival at Mercy Creek, Josiah had been taken directly to meet Reverend Thatcher. The chapel had seemed beautiful to him then, in those first innocent moments: the whitewashed walls, the wooden cross hanging above the altar, the neat rows of pews, the hymnals stacked with care. The Reverend had been warm in his welcome, had placed a hand on Josiah's shoulder and spoken kindly about the important work they would do together, about how music was the language of angels, about how blessed Josiah was to serve God in this way. That first night, Thatcher had kept him after the other boys were dismissed, had said he wanted to hear Josiah's voice properly, to assess his range and training. It had started innocently enough, scales and simple hymns, the Reverend nodding with approval. Then had come the questions about obedience, about understanding one's place, about the necessity of correction in shaping a proper servant of the Lord. Then came the first touch that wasn't fatherly, the first grip that held too tight, the first lesson in what Reverend Cornelius Thatcher's ministry truly entailed. Josiah had been too shocked to resist that first time, too confused by the contradiction between the Reverend's gentle words and his harsh actions, too trained by a lifetime of slavery to question a white man's authority. Afterward, Thatcher had explained that this was discipline, that Josiah's soul required purification, that suffering in silence was the mark of true godliness. Had quoted scripture about trials and tribulations, about the refining fire that burned away impurity. Had made it sound holy. By the second time, Josiah understood it wasn't holy at all. But by then he also understood there was no escape, no appeal, no authority higher than Thatcher's within these chapel walls. Mr. Harrow visited on Sundays to hear the choir sing and departed satisfied with his investment. The overseers never entered the chapel, that was the Reverend's domain. The other slaves knew something was wrong, but speaking of it would only bring punishment down on everyone. The system was perfect in its cruelty, self-sustaining in its silence. In the pulpit now, Thatcher's voice swelled with passion. Abraham raised the knife above his beloved son, willing to obey God's command unto death itself. Such is the nature of true faith, absolute submission, regardless of the cost. The congregation murmured their agreement, seeing themselves in Abraham's righteousness, never once wondering if they might instead be the knife. Josiah had met Samuel during his second week at Mercy Creek. Samuel had been part of Thatcher's choir for 2 years already, had learned all the hymns and all the other lessons the Reverend taught. He had recognized something in Josiah's eyes, the hollowness that came after the first vestry session, the particular shade of shame that victims carried when they'd been made complicit in their own violation through their silence. Samuel hadn't spoken of it directly, couldn't risk the words, but he'd shown small kindnesses. Had taught Josiah which floorboards in the choir box creaked and should be avoided. Had demonstrated how to stand perfectly still during services so as not to draw attention. Had shared the peppermint candies Thatcher gave after discipline sessions, a strange communion of survivors. Young Thomas had arrived 4 months ago, purchased from a failing plantation in South Carolina. At 9 years old, he still possessed some remnant of childhood innocence, still believed that adults meant what they said, that authority figures could be trusted, that God watched over the righteous. Thatcher had taken particular interest in Thomas, and had called him a pure vessel in need of careful shaping. The boy's split lip was from last Sunday, when he'd flinched during the Reverend's post-service instruction. Flinching implied distrust, and distrust required correction. Thomas was learning, slowly and painfully, that survival meant becoming stone. Elijah had been with the choir longest, 3 years, since he was 10 years old. Something had broken in him during that time, some essential part of his spirit that allowed a person to remain present in their own body. He sang when told to sing, stood when told to stand, but his eyes were always focused on distant horizons no one else could see. 3 nights ago, he'd been kept in the vestry past midnight. When he emerged, he was no longer capable of speech. Thatcher had explained to Mr. Harrow that the boy had been struck mute by the power of the Holy Spirit, a sign of divine favor. Harrow had accepted this interpretation without question, even seeming pleased by it. The chapel itself bore witness to their suffering in ways only they could read. There were bloodstains on the vestry floor that wouldn't fully wash away, faint brown shadows in the wood grain where someone had bled and the evidence had been scrubbed but not erased. There were scratch marks on the inside of the storage closet door, thin lines carved by fingernails belonging to boys whose names Josiah would never know. The cross above the altar hung slightly crooked no matter how many times it was straightened, as though the building itself rejected the symbol's presence in this place of violated sanctity. Other slaves whispered about Rowans Chapel being built on cursed ground, an old Cherokee burial site where the dead grew restless. They spoke of seeing lights in the windows late at night when the chapel should be empty, of hearing children's voices singing hymns at midnight, of a persistent cold spot near the altar that existed even in August's crushing heat. But Josiah knew the curse wasn't supernatural. The curse was human evil dressed in Sunday clothes, carrying a Bible, speaking in tongues of righteousness while committing acts that had no name in polite society. In the congregation, Mrs. Constance Harrow dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, moved by the Reverend's passionate sermon about sacrifice and faith. She was a delicate woman, prone to vapors and spiritual enthusiasms, who genuinely believed in the civilizing mission of Christianity among the enslaved. She had personally selected the fabric for the choir boys' shirts, had insisted they be given proper shoes for Sunday services, though the shoes were kept in the vestry and never worn outside the chapel. She thought herself kind. She thought herself good. She never wondered why the choir boys flinched when Reverend Thatcher approached them with fatherly affection. The Rutherford twins sat slouched in their pew, bored and sweating, waiting for the sermon to end so they could return to their usual occupations of hunting and drinking and preparing to inherit their father's plantation. They had no interest in theology or moral instruction. They attended because their mother insisted, because proper families appeared together at Sunday service, because social standing in Mercy Creek society demanded regular church attendance. They saw the choir boys the same way they saw furniture, present, functional, beneath notice. Old Mrs. Ashby was crying openly now, as she did every Sunday when the music moved her. She was known for her sensitivity, her deep feeling for spiritual matters, and her generous donations to the chapel's upkeep. She had funded the purchase of new hymnals last year, had provided the communion silver, and had ensured the Reverend's salary was paid promptly. She considered Thatcher a living saint, often said so at social gatherings, and praised his dedication to bringing the gospel to the enslaved. When he spoke of discipline and correction, she nodded vigorously, believing absolutely in his divine mandate. They all believed. That was the terrible truth Josiah had learned in 6 months at Mercy Creek. The congregation's faith was real, their piety genuine, their conviction absolute. They weren't monsters who knowingly enabled evil, they were true believers who had constructed a theology that made evil indistinguishable from good, who had built a moral framework where cruelty became kindness, where violation became instruction, where the suffering of children became evidence of God's refining work. This made them more dangerous than monsters. Monsters could be fought, recognized, named. But believers wrapped in the armor of their faith were untouchable, their actions sanctified by Scripture, their consciences clean because they'd been taught that conscience itself was an unreliable guide compared to biblical authority and social order. Josiah's hands tightened on his hymnal, crinkling the old pages. The knife beneath the altar cloth seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, calling to him, promising an end to this cycle of holy violence. He thought about what would happen after, the immediate consequences of killing a white man, a reverend, a pillar of the community. There would be no trial, no consideration of motive or circumstance. The law was clear about slaves who raised hands against masters. Death would come swiftly, probably by hanging, possibly by something worse if the community decided to make an example. But death was coming for him anyway, just more slowly. Death of spirit if not body, death of everything that made him human, death by 1,000 small violations until nothing remained but an empty shell that sang hymns and took discipline and existed without living. The knife offered a different kind of death, quick, purposeful, his choice rather than theirs. And before that death, it offered one moment of power, one instant where he would be the one holding the blade, the one delivering the lesson, the one teaching what it meant to be on the receiving end of righteousness. The sermon was building toward its conclusion. Thatcher's face gleamed with sweat and fervor, his voice reaching its thunderous peak. And so we must embrace the suffering that refines us, must accept the discipline that purifies us, must submit ourselves wholly to the divine order that elevates some and humbles others according to God's perfect wisdom. The congregation responded with hearty amens, their fans waving more vigorously, their faces shining with conviction. They had been told exactly what they wanted to hear, that their position was divinely ordained, that their comfort was holy, that the suffering of others served a sacred purpose. Samuel's shoulder pressed against Josiah's, a silent communication. He knew. Somehow, without words, he knew that today was different, that the weight in the air wasn't just August heat but something building toward release. Thomas kept his eyes down, tears finally escaping to trace lines down his cheeks that he couldn't wipe away without drawing attention. Elijah remained absent, his body present but his mind fled to safer shores. And Josiah stood in the choir box, remembering his mother's last words, "Stay alive," and understanding that he tried, had truly tried, but that some costs were too high. Some survival wasn't survival at all but just a slower form of dying. The knife waited beneath the altar cloth, silver and patient and promised. Soon the communion ritual would begin. Soon he would be called forward to assist. Soon Reverend Cornelius Thatcher would learn that the lamb could become the knife, that the meat could inherit the earth by taking it, that divine order could be overturned by a desperate boy with nothing left to lose. The sermon ended with a final thunderous proclamation about redemption through suffering. The congregation erupted in enthusiastic applause, affirming their preacher, affirming their beliefs, affirming the world they'd built on broken backs and silenced screams. Josiah's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth had gone dry. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused on that altar, on the hidden blade, on the reverend's exposed throat as he bowed his head in performative humility before beginning the communion rite. The hymn would begin soon. The blood hymn. The cutting of the covenant. The moment when everything would change, when mercy would finally come to Mercy Creek, carried on a kitchen knife and delivered by a 12-year-old boy who had learned that sometimes salvation looked like murder. The applause faded into expectant silence as Reverend Thatcher lifted his hands in benediction, his face arranged in an expression of humble authority that had taken years to perfect. This was his kingdom, these whitewashed walls and rough-hewn pews, this congregation of believers who hung on his every word. Here, he was not the failed preacher who'd been quietly asked to leave 3 churches in Charleston for reasons never spoken aloud. Here, he was beloved, respected, untouchable. "Let us prepare our hearts for communion," Thatcher intoned, his voice dropping to that intimate register he used for the most sacred moments. "Let us come before the Lord cleansed and worthy, having examined ourselves for sin and found ourselves purified through righteous correction." Josiah watched the reverend's mouth form these words about purity and cleansing, and felt bile rise in his throat. He had learned the man's entire vocabulary of euphemism and double meaning over 6 months of careful instruction. Correction. Discipline. Purification. Private prayer sessions. Each phrase is a curtain drawn over acts that had no place in any language claiming to be holy. Thatcher had come to Mercy Creek Plantation 7 years ago, carrying letters of recommendation from a bishop in Charleston who'd been eager to see him relocate to more rural ministry. The letters praised his dedication, his way with young people, his gift for music and spiritual instruction. What they didn't mention were the rumors that had followed him from congregation to congregation, whispers about why he preferred working with children, about why parents had begun finding excuses to keep their sons away from his Bible study sessions, about the real reason the bishop wanted him gone. But in the plantation system, such rumors didn't matter. The enslaved had no parents who could withdraw them from his care, no voice to raise concerns, no ability to refuse his instruction. Mr. Harrow had been delighted to secure such an educated preacher for his chapel, and had given Thatcher complete authority over the spiritual development of his human property. It was the perfect arrangement, a preacher who needed isolation and unquestioned power, a plantation owner who needed someone to make his slaves docile through religious instruction, a system designed to protect predators and silence victims. The chapel itself seemed to remember all of it, and seemed to hold the history in its very bones. Josiah had discovered things in the 7 years of Thatcher's tenure that spoke of how thoroughly the Reverend had exploited his position. In the vestry desk, hidden beneath loose boards, were letters from boys who tried to write down what was happening to them, letters that had been confiscated and never sent. On the underside of the communion table were names carved in desperate secrecy: Marcus, Isaiah, Jacob, Daniel, boys who'd passed through this choir and left only their names behind as evidence they'd existed, they'd suffered, they'd tried to be remembered. Some of those names Josiah recognized from the graveyard behind the chapel. Young slaves who died of fever, of accidents, of reasons that weren't questioned too closely because the enslaved died young often enough that it seemed natural. He wondered how many had chosen death over endurance, had walked into the river with stones in their pockets, had eaten oleander leaves from the garden, had found ways to slip free of their bodies when their bodies had become unbearable prisons. The storage closet in the vestry bore its own testimony. The scratch marks on the inside of the door were deep enough to have drawn blood from whoever made them, desperate gouges in pine wood that spoke of hours locked in darkness, of punishment for resistance or tears or any sign of unwillingness to accept the Reverend's instruction. There were stains on the floor in there too, and an iron ring bolted into the wall at waist height whose purpose Josiah had learned not to think about. But the congregation saw none of this. When they looked at Rowans Chapel, they saw a house of God, saw evidence of their own Christian charity in providing spiritual education to those they held in bondage. When they looked at Reverend Thatcher, they saw a selfless servant dedicating his life to the salvation of inferior souls. When they looked at the choir boys, they saw well-trained voices lifted in praise, proof that proper discipline and religious instruction could make even slaves into something approaching civilized. Mrs. Harrow particularly prided herself on the chapel. She had selected the fabric for the altar cloth herself, had embroidered the cross that hung behind the pulpit, and had arranged fresh flowers each Sunday when they were in season. She often told friends at social gatherings how blessed Mercy Creek was to have such a dedicated minister, how the enslaved sang with such feeling because Reverend Thatcher had taught them to truly understand the gospel. She thought the tears she sometimes saw on the choir boys' faces were evidence of spiritual awakening, of souls touched by divine grace. The truth was that Thatcher had created a perfect system of control and concealment. He selected boys for the choir who were new to the plantation, who had no family connections to speak on their behalf, who were young enough to be shaped by fear and old enough to understand the futility of resistance. He rotated them out after a few years, before they grew too old to be manageable, sending them to field work or selling them away with glowing reports of their improved character and obedience. The other slaves learned not to speak of what happened in the chapel. Those who tried found themselves sold to chain gangs or sugar plantations in Louisiana, fates so terrible they served as effective warnings. Even among the choir boys themselves, Thatcher had cultivated isolation. He punished any sign of solidarity, any attempt at comfort between them, any whispered conversation that might lead to shared understanding and therefore shared resistance. He pitted them against each other with small favors and threats, made each boy believe his particular suffering was unique and shameful, created a climate where survival meant betraying one another through silence. Yet somehow, in that silence, they had found ways to communicate. Samuel's hand briefly squeezing Josiah's during services. Thomas's quick glance of warning when Thatcher's mood was particularly dark. Even Elijah, lost in his private distance, sometimes surfaced long enough to place himself between a younger boy and the Reverend's attention, drawing correction onto himself to spare another. They were fragments of humanity clinging together in the wreckage of what Thatcher's ministry had made of them. In the pulpit now, the Reverend was explaining the communion ritual with the same theatrical piety he brought to all performances. His hands moved expressively as he spoke of Christ's sacrifice, of blood shed for the remission of sins, of the bread broken to symbolize flesh torn for humanity's salvation. The irony of these words in his mouth was so profound that Josiah almost laughed, a sound that would have emerged as something broken and terrible if he'd allowed it past his lips. Thatcher's theology was carefully constructed to justify his actions while condemning any resistance to them. He preached that suffering was redemptive, that pain purified, that submission to authority, particularly his authority, was submission to God himself. He quoted Paul extensively about slaves obeying masters, ignored Jesus' teachings about the least of these, and wove together a gospel that made power righteous and powerlessness deserved. His sermons were masterworks of selective scripture, creating a God who looked remarkably like a plantation owner and sounded remarkably like an overseer. The congregation absorbed this theology eagerly because it absolved them of guilt while sanctifying their privilege. They could own human beings and feel holy doing it. They could ignore suffering and call it divine will. They could build wealth on brutality and consider themselves blessed. Thatcher gave them permission to be comfortable in their cruelty by making cruelty indistinguishable from Christianity. But there were cracks in his perfect system, small fissures that were beginning to widen. Elijah's muteness had raised questions, even if Harrow had accepted the spiritual explanation. Thomas's visible injuries were becoming harder to attribute to clumsiness. Whispers were spreading among the enslaved that Rowans Chapel was cursed, that the dead were restless there, that evil had taken up residence in a house supposedly dedicated to good. Even some of the house slaves who served at the main plantation were beginning to mention strange things, lights in the chapel windows at night when no service was scheduled, sounds like children weeping that seemed to come from the walls themselves, a persistent cold spot near the altar that made them reluctant to clean there. Thatcher dismissed such talk as superstition, as evidence of the primitive minds he was working to elevate through Christian teaching. But Josiah had noticed the Reverend's own discomfort in the chapel when he was alone, the way he hurried through his preparations before services, the way he sometimes glanced over his shoulder at the vestry door as though expecting to see something there. Perhaps even predators could sense when their hunting ground had become contaminated by too much death, too much suffering, too much weight of accumulated sin. The Reverend's voice rose again, pulling Josiah back to the present moment. "We are instruments of God's purpose," Thatcher proclaimed, his eyes sweeping across the congregation before landing with particular intensity on the choir boys. "Through us, the divine will is enacted. Through us, correction comes to those who require it. Through us, the lesser are raised up and made acceptable in the sight of the Lord." His gaze lingered on Josiah, and in that moment, the boys saw something flicker across the Reverend's face: anticipation, possession, the look of a man contemplating property he owned and intended to use. The smile that followed was meant to appear paternal but contained an edge of promise, a reminder of what awaited after the service, in the vestry, where lessons would continue and obedience would be tested and righteousness would be delivered with whiskey-scented breath and soft hands that knew how to cause pain without leaving marks that might raise questions. Josiah's fingers moved unconsciously toward the edge of the choir box, toward the altar beyond it, toward the knife that waited beneath white cloth embroidered with crosses. His heartbeat had steadied into something cold and purposeful. Fear had burned away, leaving only clarity. He understood now with perfect certainty that he was going to do this thing, that he was going to reach for that blade and draw it across Thatcher's throat, that he was going to spill the Reverend's blood across his altar and his communion elements and his carefully maintained facade of holiness. He understood too that this act would damn him by every measure the congregation recognized. They would call him murderer, devil, the worst kind of savage who had betrayed the kindness shown to him by raising violence against his betters. They would never comprehend that he was not betraying kindness but answering cruelty, that he was not savage but desperate, that he was not devil but simply human and pushed beyond the breaking point of human endurance. The Reverend would die surprised, Josiah thought. Would die still believing he had the right to do what he'd been doing, that his position and his race and his education gave him authority over bodies and souls. Would die without understanding that he'd created his own executioner through 7 years of careful torture disguised as ministry. "Let us prepare for communion," Thatcher announced, and his voice carried the weight of ritual and tradition, of 7 years of services conducted without interruption, of absolute confidence in the order of things. "Josiah, come forward to assist me." The moment had arrived. Josiah stepped down from the choir box, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor, his hands steady now, his mind clear as Sunday morning light filtering through the chapel windows. Behind him, he felt Samuel's eyes on his back, felt the weight of Thomas's fear and Elijah's distant witnessing. Around him, the congregation settled into expectant peace, ready to receive their sacrament, oblivious to the fact that today's communion would be very different from any that had come before. Thatcher smiled as Josiah approached the altar, that warm paternal smile that made the congregation sigh with satisfaction at the Reverend's kind way with the enslaved. The smile that made Josiah's skin crawl with memory and anticipation. The knife was 3 feet away now, hidden beneath cloth, waiting. 2 feet. 1. Thatcher's hand reached out to grip Josiah's shoulder, to guide him into position for the ritual. The touch that always preceded more, the claiming gesture that announced ownership and intention. Josiah's hand moved toward the altar cloth, toward the blade beneath, toward the end of suffering and the beginning of consequence. The chapel held its breath. The candles flickered. The shadows gathered close, as though the dead carved into the storage closet door and buried in the graveyard out back were leaning in to watch, to bear witness, to finally, see their tormentor receive some measure of earthly justice before whatever waited beyond. Drop a comment below telling us what you think drives someone to such desperate violence. And don't forget to subscribe for more horrifying true stories. Reverend Thatcher's hand lay heavy on Josiah's shoulder, a weight the boy had learned to dread more than any overseer's whip, more than hunger or exhaustion or the endless brutality of plantation life. There was possession in that touch, ownership expressed through flesh pressing against flesh, a reminder that extended far beyond this public moment into private horrors the congregation would never witness. The Reverend's fingers squeezed gently, almost affectionately, and Josiah felt his stomach turn over with revulsion and memory. "Take up the chalice, boy," Thatcher said softly, his voice carrying that particular tone of intimate instruction that always preceded the worst moments. To the congregation, it sounded like patient teaching, a shepherd guiding his flock. But Josiah heard the undercurrent of anticipation, the promise threaded through the words like poison through honey. The Reverend was already planning tonight's vestry session, already contemplating the discipline he would deliver for some invented transgression, already savoring the power he would exercise once the chapel was empty and the doors were locked. Josiah moved toward the altar, each step feeling both impossibly slow and terrifyingly fast. The chalice sat in its usual position, filled with wine that caught the candlelight and gleamed dark as blood. Beside it, the communion bread waited on a silver plate, small pieces torn from a loaf, meant to represent Christ's broken body. The symbolism had never seemed more grotesque than it did now, this ritual of consumption and sacrifice performed by a man who consumed children and called it holy. His hand reached past the chalice. His fingers found the edge of the altar cloth, the white linen that Mrs. Harrow had embroidered with such care, such pride in her Christian charity. Beneath it, wrapped in a strip of burlap to keep it from rattling, the kitchen knife waited. Josiah's palm closed around the handle, and the wood was warm against his skin, as though the blade itself had been waiting with the same desperate patience he'd carried for 6 months. The chapel had transformed around him into something dreamlike and terrible. The August heat had thickened until it felt solid, pressing against his lungs with each breath. The tallow candles scattered throughout the space guttered and smoked despite the stillness of the air, their flames bending and dancing to wind that didn't exist. Shadows stretched across the walls in configurations that defied their sources, reaching toward the altar like dark fingers, like the hands of all the boys who had suffered here reaching forward through time to guide this moment into being. The congregation sat motionless in their pews, frozen in poses of pious expectation. Their faces had blurred somehow, features running together like paint and rain, until Josiah couldn't tell one from another. They were just a mass of witness, of complicated spectatorship, of chosen blindness made flesh. Mrs. Harrow's handkerchief paused halfway to her eyes. Mr. Rutherford's fan hung suspended in mid-wave. Old Mrs. Ashby's mouth was open in the beginning of some hymn that wouldn't emerge. Time itself seemed to have slowed, stretching this moment into an eternity where Josiah stood balanced on the knife's edge between endurance and action. He looked at the other choir boys. Samuel had gone completely still, his eyes locked on Josiah's hand beneath the altar cloth, understanding written across his face in letters of recognition and fear and something that might have been hope. Samuel knew. He'd been surviving Thatcher's ministry for 2 years, had learned to read the signs of breaking points, had perhaps been waiting for one of them to reach this moment when survival through submission was no longer possible. His lips moved in what might have been prayer or warning or encouragement, but no sound emerged. Young Thomas had tears streaming freely down his face now, though whether they were for himself or for Josiah or for all of them collectively was impossible to say. His small hands gripped his hymnal so tightly the pages crumpled, and his whole body trembled like a bird with a broken wing. He was still young enough to believe that adults would intervene, that someone would step forward to prevent what was building toward release, that the world contained justice accessible to boys like them. But no one moved. No one saw. The congregation remained frozen in their comfortable righteousness, seeing only what they chose to see. Elijah alone seemed present and distant simultaneously, his eyes focused on Josiah with an intensity that suggested he'd surfaced from whatever far shore his mind had fled to 3 nights ago. There was no judgment in his gaze, no fear, no hope, only a terrible understanding that this moment had been inevitable from the first time Thatcher had locked the vestry door, that violence deferred was still violence, that the cycle could only end when someone found the courage or the desperation to break it. Thatcher's hand on Josiah's shoulder tightened, pulling him back from these observations, anchoring him in the physical present. The chalice, Josiah, the Reverend repeated, a note of warning entering his voice now. He'd noticed the boy's distraction, noticed the hand that had moved toward the altar cloth and paused there, noticed perhaps some quality in the air that suggested this Sunday was different from all the Sundays that had preceded it. Josiah's fingers closed fully around the knife handle. The blade was 10 inches long, honed sharp for cutting through meat and gristle, heavy enough to do serious work. He'd tested its edge yesterday in the cookhouse, had watched it slice through a turnip with almost no pressure, had imagined how easily it would part flesh, open arteries, spill the life from a man who thought himself untouchable. Boy. Thatcher's voice carried an edge now, that shift from false kindness to veiled threat that Josiah knew intimately. The Reverend's grip on his shoulder was becoming painful, fingers digging into the bruises already there from last night's discipline. In another moment, Thatcher would become suspicious, would pull Josiah away from the altar, would perhaps discover the knife and understand what had almost happened. The moment was collapsing, time resuming its normal flow, opportunity beginning to close like a door swinging shut. Josiah pulled the knife free and turned in one fluid motion, the blade emerging from beneath the altar cloth like a prayer finally answered. The burlap wrapping fell away. Steel caught candlelight and threw it back in sharp glints that seemed impossibly bright in the chapel's dimness. For one suspended heartbeat, Josiah stood with the knife visible, held low against his thigh, while Thatcher's face registered confusion, then comprehension, then something that might have been fear beginning to bloom. What? The Reverend started, his hand releasing Josiah's shoulder, moving instead toward the knife, toward disarming this impossible threat. His mouth was open, preparing to shout for help, to call the congregation to action, to reassert his authority through volume and command. His face had gone from its usual ruddy confidence to something paler, eyes widening as the reality of his vulnerability finally penetrated the armor of his position and privilege. But Josiah was already moving. 6 months of accumulated rage and terror and violated innocence poured into his arm, giving strength to muscles that shouldn't have been capable of what he was attempting. The knife rose in an arc that felt both foreign and natural, a movement his body seemed to know despite never having practiced it, as though violence was a language written into bone and blood that only needed desperate circumstances to become fluent. Thatcher tried to step backward, tried to raise his hands in defense, but the altar was behind him and there was nowhere to retreat. His mouth opened wider, the shout beginning to form, sound starting to emerge that would bring the congregation surging forward, would end this before it began. Josiah's arm completed its arc. The blade connected with Thatcher's outstretched hand first, opening a deep gash across the palm that immediately began pouring blood. The Reverend's forming shout became a scream of pain and shock, a sound so raw and animal that it seemed impossible it could come from a man who spoke with such cultured authority from the pulpit. The congregation jerked into motion, time snapping back to its normal pace like a stretched cord released. Heads turned toward the altar. Fans dropped from their hands. Someone, Mrs. Ashby, perhaps, began screaming in response to Thatcher's scream, a harmony of horror that filled the chapel with discordant music. But Josiah wasn't finished. The first cut had been wild, defensive, and had caught hand instead of throat. He adjusted his grip, stepped closer instead of retreating, pressed forward into the space Thatcher's backward stumble had created. The Reverend's bleeding hand clutched at his chest, leaving crimson streaks across his white vestments, while his other hand groped blindly for purchase against the altar, knocking over the chalice so communion wine spilled across the embroidered cloth in a dark flood. "Please," Thatcher gasped, and it was the first time Josiah had ever heard him beg, the first time fear had cracked through the veneer of unassailable confidence. The Reverend's eyes met Josiah's, and in them the boy saw recognition finally arriving, saw Thatcher understanding that he was seeing Josiah as human for perhaps the first time, seeing him as capable of action and agency, seeing him as dangerous. Too late. Recognition had come far too late. Josiah struck again, and this time his aim was true. The blade swept across Thatcher's exposed throat in a motion that felt both endless and instantaneous, opening flesh with a smoothness that was almost surgical. For one moment nothing happened, the cut was so clean it seemed to have done no damage at all. Thatcher's eyes widened further, his mouth working soundlessly, his hands moving toward his neck in slow confusion. Then the blood came. It emerged in a pulsing surge that was shockingly red, impossibly bright, more vivid than anything Josiah had ever seen. It cascaded down the Reverend's white vestments, transforming them from symbols of purity into canvases of scarlet testimony. It splattered across the altar cloth, mixing with the spilled wine until sacred and profane became indistinguishable. It hit the open Bible with a sound like rain on leaves, staining the pages of Ephesians where Thatcher had been marking his place for next week's sermon about obedience and submission. The Reverend's hands clutched uselessly at his ruined throat, trying to hold closed what could not be closed, trying to keep inside what was already pouring out. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, producing only wet gurgling sounds instead of the commanding voice that had preached about divine order and righteous suffering. His legs buckled, and he crumpled against the altar, then slid slowly down its face, leaving a smear of blood on the white cloth like a signature, like evidence, like truth finally made visible. The hymn that had been building in the background, the congregation had been preparing to sing during communion, died in a collective gasp of horror. The chapel filled instead with screams and shouts, with the sound of bodies surging from pews, with chaos erupting where order had reigned for 7 years without interruption. But Josiah stood motionless at the center of the storm, the knife still gripped in his hand, blood dripping from the blade to pool at his bare feet. He watched Thatcher's eyes go from shock to confusion to something like understanding to nothing at all, watched the life drain from them along with the blood draining from his throat, watched the man who had seemed so powerful and untouchable become simply meat cooling on a chapel floor. The Reverend's last breath emerged as a bubble of blood from his ruined throat. His hands fell away from his neck, landing palm up in postures of supplication or surrender. His body went slack against the altar's base, head tilted back, eyes fixed on the ceiling as though searching for the heaven he'd preached about so confidently, as though expecting God to intervene on behalf of his servant. No intervention came. The rough-hewn beams of the ceiling remained silent and indifferent. The crooked cross continued hanging at its eternal angle. The chapel that had witnessed 7 years of sanctified abuse now bore witness to its ending, and if the building itself had any judgment to pass, it expressed it only through the way the candlelight seemed to brighten slightly, the shadows to recede, as though something dark and heavy had lifted from the space. Josiah stood over Thatcher's body, chest heaving, the knife trembling now in his grip, and felt absolutely nothing. No triumph, no relief, no fear, no regret. Just a vast emptiness where emotion should have lived, as though he'd used up every feeling he possessed in that single motion of the blade. He was hollow, scraped clean, a vessel emptied of everything but the simple fact of what he'd done. The congregation was moving toward him now, Mr. Harrow in the lead with murder in his eyes and righteous rage in his voice, demanding to know what devil had possessed this slave boy, what evil had driven him to such impossible transgression. But their words reached Josiah as though from very far away, as though he'd already departed this place even though his body remained standing in an expanding pool of the Reverend's blood. Behind him in the choir box, Samuel had begun to sing. A single pure note rising into the chaos, a hymn Thatcher had taught them about washing clean, about sins purged, about blood that cleansed all stains. His voice cut through the screaming and the shouting like light through darkness, beautiful and terrible and true. Samuel's voice rose higher, filling the chapel with a purity that seemed impossible given the carnage spreading across the altar. Thomas joined him after a moment's hesitation, his child soprano weaving through Samuel's melody like thread through fabric, creating harmonies they'd practiced 100 times under Thatcher's demanding instruction. Even Elijah, silent for 3 days, opened his mouth and let sound emerge, cracked and broken, but unmistakably his voice returning, as though the Reverend's death had somehow released whatever had been strangling his ability to speak. The hymn they sang was "Nothing But the Blood," one of Thatcher's favorites, one he'd made them rehearse until their throats were raw, until every note was perfect, until the words about cleansing and redemption rolled off their tongues with the practiced ease of liturgy. Now those same words took on new meaning, floating over Cornelius Thatcher's cooling corpse and the blood pooling beneath it, testimony and eulogy and accusation all woven together in 3-part harmony. Mr. Barnabas Harrow stopped his advance toward Josiah, frozen by the surreal horror of the choir continuing to sing while their director lay murdered at the altar. His face had gone purple with rage and incomprehension, veins standing out on his forehead like rivers on a map of fury. Behind him, the congregation had become a churning mass of confusion, some pressing forward to see the impossible scene, others retreating toward the doors, women screaming and men shouting orders that contradicted each other into meaningless noise. But something held them all back from simply rushing forward and seizing Josiah. Perhaps it was the knife still dripping in his hand, the evidence that this small boy was capable of shocking violence. Perhaps it was the 3 remaining choir boys singing their hymn with eyes that had finally, terribly, opened. Perhaps it was the sight of Thatcher's body, so recently powerful and authoritative, now reduced to meat and rapidly cooling blood, that made them hesitate, confronting the reality that flesh was flesh regardless of skin color or social position, that mortality made equals of everyone when steel found the throat. Mrs. Constance Harrow had pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror above the lace edge. She stared at Josiah as though he were some creature from nightmare made manifest, as though the docile property she'd selected shirts for had revealed itself to be something monstrous. Her 3 daughters huddled against her skirts, their pale faces mirroring their mother's shock, their carefully cultivated innocence shattered by the sight of blood on holy ground. The Rutherford twins had drawn closer to each other, their bored expressions replaced by something more complex, fascination mixed with fear, the recognition that the social order they'd inherited and never questioned might be less stable than they'd assumed. If a slave child could murder a reverend in front of the entire congregation, what else might be possible? What other inversions of proper hierarchy might occur? Old Mrs. Ashby had stopped crying. She sat rigid in her pew, staring at the scene with an expression that might have been horror or might have been something else entirely, perhaps the dawning comprehension that her generous donations had funded something far darker than spiritual education, that the saints she'd praised had been something else altogether, that her comfortable certainty about the rightness of things had been built on foundations she'd chosen never to examine. Josiah stood at the center of their stairs, the knife heavy in his hand, blood cooling on his skin and clothes, and felt himself becoming something other than human in their eyes. He was transforming before their gaze from property into monster, from victim into perpetrator, from sufferer into threat. They would never understand what had driven him to this act, would never comprehend the accumulated weight of violation that had made this violence feel like the only possible response. They would see only a slave who had killed his master, a boy who had murdered a man of God, an act of incomprehensible evil that confirmed every prejudice they held about the savage nature requiring their civilizing control. Seize him. Harrow finally found his voice, the command emerging as a roar that cut through the hymn and the chaos. Seize that murdering devil before he kills again. But still no one moved. The hymn continued, building toward its chorus about nothing but the blood of Jesus washing white as snow, the irony so profound it seemed to paralyze the congregation. 3 boys singing about cleansing while standing over their tormentor's corpse, their voices unchanged by what had just occurred, their training so thorough that they could perform even in the midst of catastrophe. Then Samuel's voice broke. Not from emotion or weakness, but deliberately, he cut off mid-verse and let silence rush back into the space. Thomas and Elijah followed his lead, their voices dying away until the chapel held only the sound of ragged breathing and the wet gurgle of Thatcher's last remaining life draining from his open throat. Samuel stepped down from the choir box. His movements were slow, deliberate, unthreatening. He walked toward Josiah with his hands visible and empty, his face showing no fear of the blade or the boy who held it. When he reached the altar, he stood beside Josiah, not touching him, not speaking, but present in a way that made a statement clearer than words. He was choosing to stand with the murderer rather than the murdered, aligning himself with the one who had finally acted rather than the ones who had watched and done nothing. After a heartbeat's hesitation, Thomas climbed down as well. His small legs carried him forward, his child's face streaked with tears but determined. He took his place on Josiah's other side, barely reaching his shoulder, looking like he might blow away in a strong wind but standing firm nonetheless. Elijah came last, moving like a man walking through deep water, each step requiring visible effort. But he came, and when he reached the others, he did something unexpected. He reached out and took Josiah's free hand, the one not holding the knife, and squeezed it gently. His voice, unused for 3 days and raw from sudden singing, emerged as barely more than a whisper, "We see you. We know. We were there too." The simple words shattered something in Josiah's hollowness. Tears came suddenly, blurring his vision, streaming down his face to mix with the blood spattering his shirt. His hand opened, and the knife clattered to the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the shocked silence. His knees buckled, and he would have fallen except that Samuel and Elijah were there, holding him upright, while Thomas pressed against his side like an anchor to keep him from drifting away entirely. "Dear God," someone whispered from the congregation, Josiah couldn't identify who. "Dear God in heaven, what has happened here?" What had happened was both simple and infinitely complex. A child had murdered a man. But that child had been driven to murder by the man's actions, actions enabled by a system that gave absolute power to some and removed all protection from others, actions sanctified by theology that made cruelty indistinguishable from discipline. What had happened was the inevitable end point of treating human beings as property, of building Christianity into a justification for brutality, of looking away from suffering because acknowledging it would require change. But the congregation would never understand it that way. They saw only the surface: slave-killing master, property-destroying owner, chaos erupting from divinely ordained order. They saw confirmation of every fear they held about what might happen if they loosened their control, if they acknowledged humanity in those they held in bondage, if they admitted that the system they benefited from was fundamentally evil. Mr. Harrow finally moved, striding forward with his face set in grim determination. He grabbed Josiah by the arm, yanking him away from the other boys with enough force to nearly dislocate the shoulder. The knife lay forgotten on the floor as Harrow twisted Josiah's arms behind his back with practiced brutality, the same efficiency he might use to restrain a troublesome horse or dangerous dog. "You'll hang for this," Harrow hissed close to Josiah's ear, his breath hot with rage and something else, fear, perhaps, at how close this violence had come to his own family, how easily a slave's knife might find an owner's throat if this rebellion spread. "You'll hang slow, boy, and every slave for 50 miles will watch. They'll see what happens to murderers. They'll learn what comes from raising hands against their betters." Josiah said nothing. There was nothing to say. He'd known the consequences before he reached for the knife, had accepted them as the price of ending what could not be endured. Death by hanging was still death by his own choice rather than death by slow destruction of everything that made him human. It was still better than another night in the vestry, another year of Thatcher's ministry, another decade of surviving by dying in pieces too small to mourn. Samuel tried to step forward, tried to speak, but one of the Rutherford twins grabbed him and threw him back toward the choir box with casual violence. Thomas received similar treatment, sent sprawling across the floor with a shove that would leave bruises. Only Elijah remained standing, his newfound voice deserting him again, his eyes fixed on Josiah with an expression of such profound understanding that it was almost unbearable to witness. The congregation surged forward now, the spell of shock finally broken by Harrow's action. They surrounded Josiah in a pressing mass of bodies, all wanting to see the monster up close, to reassure themselves that he was properly restrained, to verify that order had been restored even if it had come too late to save their reverend. Their faces swam in Josiah's dimming vision, shock, fear, rage, satisfaction at his capture, all blending together into an indistinguishable mass of witness. Someone had gone for rope. Josiah felt it bite into his wrists as they bound him, pulling tight enough to cut off circulation, to cause pain that was somehow distant and irrelevant compared to everything else. They bound his ankles too, though he made no attempt to run, showed no resistance. Where would he run to? Where could any of them ever run to in a world designed to prevent their escape? Mrs. Harrow was sobbing now, being led from the chapel by her daughters, unable to bear the sight of the carnage any longer. Other women followed, seeking the comfort of fresh air and distance from the reality of what their comfortable lives had been built upon. The men remained, forming a guard around Josiah, already planning the spectacle his execution would become, already composing the narrative they would tell about this day. In that narrative, Reverend Cornelius Thatcher would be martyred, elevated to sainthood by the manner of his death. His decades of service would be praised, his dedication to civilizing the enslaved held up as exemplary. His real nature, the predator hiding behind religious authority, would be erased, forgotten, declared impossible to believe. Any slave who spoke otherwise would be punished for spreading lies about a man who could no longer defend himself. And Josiah would become the devil incarnate, proof of the savage nature requiring chains and control, evidence that mercy toward slaves was dangerous folly, justification for even harsher restrictions and more brutal discipline. His reasons would be dismissed as lies or delusions. His suffering would be declared irrelevant or deserved. His act of desperate self-defense would be transformed into unprovoked evil, used to justify the very system that had created the conditions making that act inevitable. The truth would die with Thatcher, because the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. Josiah looked back at the altar one final time as they dragged him toward the chapel doors. Thatcher's body lay in spreading blood, his eyes open and unseeing, his mouth slack, his hands curled into claws that had grasped for life and found nothing. The white altar cloth was ruined beyond any cleaning, stained so thoroughly that no amount of scrubbing would restore its purity, a permanent record of what had transpired here, even if no one would read it correctly. The knife lay where it had fallen, its blade still wet with blood and justice and the end of 7 years of sanctified horror. And standing in the choir box, Thomas and Samuel and Elijah watched Josiah being carried away, their faces showing grief and recognition and the terrible knowledge that they would survive this by returning to silence, by accepting whatever new reverend came to replace Thatcher, by enduring because enduring was all they had. The chapel doors swung open, and August sunlight poured in, brilliant and merciless, illuminating the scene in stark detail, the blood, the body, the boys, the congregation, the whole tableau of violence and its aftermath frozen in painful clarity. Then Josiah was through the doors and outside, into air that tasted of freedom for one brief moment before the rope tightened and the reality of what came next settled over him like a shroud. Behind him, the chapel doors closed. Inside, men were already beginning to clean up, to restore order, to erase the evidence of what had happened. But some stains, Josiah knew, would never wash away. Some blood seeped too deep into the wood, became part of the structure itself, testified forever even when no one was willing to listen to its testimony. They kept Josiah in the smokehouse for 3 days while preparations were made. The small wooden structure was windowless and stifling in the August heat, filled with the lingering smell of cured meat and old smoke that seemed to coat his lungs with every breath. They'd left his hands bound behind his back, the rope cutting deeper each day as his wrists swelled, but they'd removed the ankle restraint so he could stand when his legs would still bear his weight. No one spoke to him except to shove corn mush through the door once a day, barely enough to keep him alive for the execution they were planning with such elaborate care. On the first day, Josiah could hear the activity outside, hammers driving nails, the rasp of saw through wood, men's voices calling instructions as they constructed the gallows in the main yard where every slave on Mercy Creek plantation would be forced to watch. Mr. Harrow wanted it visible from the fields, and wanted it to stand as a permanent reminder of what happened to those who forgot their place. The structure would remain after Josiah's body was cut down, a monument to order restored through violence, a promise of consequences for any who might consider following his example. On the second day, word must have spread to neighboring plantations because Josiah could hear the sound of arriving horses, voices he didn't recognize discussing the unprecedented nature of what had occurred. A slave murdering a white man in church was the stuff of nightmares for the planter class, the scenario they constructed elaborate systems of control to prevent. Josiah's execution needed to be spectacular enough to extinguish any ember of rebellion it might have sparked, brutal enough to remind every enslaved person for miles around that resistance ended only in death. On the third day came the visitors he hadn't expected. The smokehouse door opened to reveal Samuel, Thomas, and Elijah, escorted by an overseer who looked uncomfortable with his assignment but followed orders nonetheless. They'd been allowed 5 minutes, a strange mercy Josiah suspected came from Mrs. Harrow, who perhaps couldn't quite reconcile what she'd witnessed with the narrative being constructed around it. Samuel knelt beside Josiah in the dim light, his face drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, grief mixed with guilt mixed with gratitude he couldn't express in front of their guard. He reached out and adjusted Josiah's shirt, a gesture of care that was the only comfort he could offer. "They're bringing in a new reverend next month," he whispered. "From Alabama. They say he's experienced with difficult cases." The words landed like stones. Nothing had changed. Nothing would change. Thatcher would be replaced by another Thatcher, the choir would sing for another predator, the cycle would continue because the system that enabled it remained intact. Josiah's sacrifice had ended one man's reign of terror but left the structure of terror itself untouched. Thomas pressed something into Josiah's bound hands, a peppermint candy, one of the kind Thatcher had given them after discipline sessions. The gesture was so unexpected, so layered with meaning, that Josiah felt tears prick his eyes. The boy was offering forgiveness, or solidarity, or perhaps just acknowledgement that they'd all been victims of the same violence even if only one of them had found the strength or desperation to fight back. Elijah spoke last, his voice still rough from disuse but growing stronger. "I remember everything now," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Josiah's with painful clarity. "What he did. What he was. What you stopped him from doing again. I couldn't speak it before, but I can now. I will now, even if no one believes me." "Time's up," the overseer grunted, gesturing for the boys to leave. Samuel gripped Josiah's shoulder one final time, a brother's farewell. Thomas's small hand brushed against Josiah's head in something like a blessing. And Elijah straightened his spine, standing taller than Josiah had ever seen him stand, as though witnessing murder had somehow returned to him the humanity that Thatcher's abuse had stolen. Then they were gone, and Josiah was alone again with the darkness and the smoke smell and the knowledge that tomorrow he would die. The execution was scheduled for dawn, that liminal time between night and day when the world felt suspended between states. They came for him as the first gray light began seeping across the horizon, dragging him from the smokehouse into air that felt impossibly fresh after 3 days of confinement. His legs barely held him, weakened by hunger and stillness, but the guards didn't care, they half-carried, half-dragged him toward the gallows that loomed against the lightning sky like a dark prayer. Every slave from Mercy Creek had been assembled in the yard, forced to witness what came from resistance. They stood in silent rows, faces carefully blank, eyes downcast, presenting the mask of submission that survival required. But Josiah could feel something underneath their stillness, not quite sympathy, not quite solidarity, but recognition. They understood what had driven him to violence, even if they could never say so aloud, even if his death would teach them only to hide their rage deeper, never to let it surface in action. The gallows stood 12 feet high, rough pine wood that still smelled of fresh sawdust. The noose dangled from the crossbeam, rope thick as a man's wrist, the knot tied with professional precision by someone who'd done this work before. A wooden platform with a trap door waited beneath it, and standing beside the platform was Mr. Harrow, looking grimly satisfied with the proceedings, ready to demonstrate his mastery over property that had forgotten its place. They hauled Josiah up the steps, each one in agony on legs that could barely bend. At the top, they positioned him on the trap door, the wood creaking under his slight weight. Someone, not Harrow, one of the overseers, placed the noose around his neck, adjusting it with impersonal efficiency, tightening it until the rope bit into the bruises Thatcher had left there days before. Harrow began to speak, his voice carrying across the assembled slaves in a rehearsed speech about justice and order, about the wages of sin and the necessity of harsh punishment for unspeakable crimes. He described Thatcher as a martyr, a dedicated servant of God struck down by evil incarnate. He painted Josiah as demon, as monster, as proof that the enslaved could never be trusted without constant vigilance and harsh discipline. Josiah heard the words but didn't listen to them. His eyes had found the 3 choir boys standing in the front row of witnesses, placed there deliberately to drive home the lesson of what happened to murderers. Samuel's face was stone, giving nothing away, but his hand had found Thomas's and held it tightly. Elijah stood apart, his mouth moving in what might have been prayer or might have been testimony to a God Josiah no longer believed in. The speech concluded. Harrow asked if Josiah had any final words, a pro forma question that expected no answer. Slaves weren't supposed to speak at their own executions, weren't supposed to disrupt the narrative with inconvenient truths. But Josiah found his voice one last time. It emerged cracked and rough, but clear enough to carry across the assembled witnesses, "I'm not sorry." 3 words. Simple. Irrevocable. True. Harrow's face purpled with fresh rage at this final defiance. He gestured sharply to the executioner, abandoning protocol, wanting this finished, wanting the questioning voice silenced forever. The trap door opened. Josiah dropped. The rope caught with a jerk that snapped his neck cleanly, a mercy, though not an intended one, simply the physics of drop and weight and the executioner's accidental competence. There was no slow strangulation, no minutes of struggling for air while the crowd watched. Just the sudden shock of falling arrested, the vertebrae separating, the immediate darkness. His last sensation was not pain but something else, a loosening, a release, a sense of weight falling away that had nothing to do with the body swinging from the gallows. Then nothing. They left him hanging until noon, a display meant to be viewed, absorbed, remembered. Then they cut him down and buried him without a marker in the far corner of the graveyard behind Rowans Chapel, as far as possible from Thatcher's ornate headstone that praised his 20 years of faithful service and mourned his tragic murder. The contrast was deliberate, the honored dead in consecrated ground, the murderer in unmarked earth, a final statement about the order of things. But the chapel itself had other ideas about order. Within a week, strange things began to happen. The bloodstains on the altar, scrubbed repeatedly by house slaves assigned the task, kept reappearing, faint brown shadows that looked like rust in daylight but gleamed wet and red by candlelight. The communion silver tarnished overnight no matter how thoroughly it was polished. The cross above the altar fell twice, narrowly missing people both times, and afterward hung at an even more pronounced angle that no adjustment could correct. The new reverend arrived in September, a stern-faced man from Alabama with letters of recommendation praising his firm hand with difficult congregations. He lasted 3 weeks before requesting immediate transfer, claiming the chapel was unsuited for proper ministry, though he wouldn't elaborate on what he meant. His replacement stayed barely a month, departing in the middle of the night with no explanation at all. The slaves knew why. They heard things the white congregation didn't, children's voices singing hymns when the chapel stood empty, the sound of weeping that seemed to come from the walls themselves, footsteps in the vestry when no one was there. Some claimed to have seen a small figure standing at the altar in the pre-dawn darkness, illuminated by no visible light source, holding something that gleamed like silver. Samuel took over as the informal leader of the choir, teaching the younger boys who replaced Thomas and Elijah when they were sold away that winter, sold because their presence reminded Mrs. Harrow too much of the violence she'd witnessed, because she couldn't look at them without remembering how they'd stood beside a murderer. Samuel taught the new boys the hymns Thatcher had favored, but he taught them something else too in whispered moments when no overseers were listening. He taught them that they were human, that their suffering mattered, that silence was survival but remembering was resistance. He taught them about Josiah. The story spread through the slave quarters, transmitted in careful whispers, modified and mythologized with each telling. Josiah grew in the telling, grew older, stronger, more deliberate in his planning, more righteous in his execution. The killing became justice rather than murder, divine retribution rather than desperate violence. Thatcher's crimes were spoken aloud in the dark, details shared that had been hidden in shame, patterns revealed that individuals had hidden in isolation. The narrative the planters tried to impose, savage slave-murdering godly preacher, couldn't compete with the truth that spread through the quarters. The enslaved knew better. They'd known what happened in vestries and storage closets, had known and been powerless to stop it, had lived with the weight of that knowledge and their own inability to intervene. Josiah's act gave them something they hadn't possessed before, proof that the powerful could be held accountable, that violence could flow in both directions, that the system's stability was more fragile than it appeared. Rowans Chapel stood empty more often than not in the years that followed. Preachers came and went, never staying long, always finding reasons to request transfers to more accommodating ministries. The congregation dwindled as families found excuses to worship elsewhere, claiming the chapel was too small or too far or too difficult to reach. The building itself seemed to decay faster than weather alone could explain, boards warping, roof tiles loosening, windows cracking for no apparent reason. By 1845, regular services had ceased entirely. The structure remained standing, but it stood as a monument rather than church, memorial rather than ministry. Local legend transformed it into a haunted site, though the truth of what haunted it was far more human than supernatural. It was haunted by memory, by testimony, by the accumulated weight of suffering that had occurred within its walls while prayers rose toward an indifferent heaven. The Harrow family sold Mercy Creek Plantation in 1847, relocating to Charleston where the social stain of what had happened might be diluted by distance and urban anonymity. The new owners considered tearing down the chapel but found the labor unpleasant. Every work crew reported illness, injury, or simple refusal to complete the task. So it remained, slowly returning to the Georgia earth that had witnessed its construction, its years of dual purpose as house of worship and house of horror, its final transformation into something else entirely. Samuel survived to see emancipation, though just barely. He died in 1866 at the age of 36, worn out by years of field labor after the choir was disbanded. His last words, spoken to the woman who'd become his wife in freedom, were reportedly a hymn. "Nothing but the blood," he sang with his failing voice. "Nothing but the blood of Jesus." Whether he meant it as testimony of faith or as a reminder of blood spilled on an altar, she never knew for certain. Thomas disappeared from the historical record after being sold in 1840, his fate unknown, his 9-year-old self swallowed by the vast machinery of the domestic slave trade. Elijah survived the war and lived until 1889, long enough to tell his story to his grandchildren, long enough to ensure that one version of the truth was preserved in oral history, passed down through generations who would otherwise never have known that Josiah existed, that he mattered, that his desperate act of violence was both terrible and understandable. Reverend Cornelius Thatcher's gravestone remained in place for decades, its inscription praising his dedication and mourning his tragic death. But time and weather worked on the marble, eroding the carved letters, until eventually his name became illegible, his dates uncertain, his legacy reduced to a crooked stone in an overgrown cemetery that no one visited anymore. Josiah's unmarked grave in the far corner fared differently. Wildflowers grew there, not the cultivated flowers from the main graveyard, but wild varieties that seeded themselves and returned year after year without tending. Peppermint grew there too, spreading in fragrant patches that seemed to appear from nowhere, their presence inexplicable to anyone who didn't know the significance of peppermint candies given after discipline, comfort offered after violation, sweetness used to mask bitterness. The story of the Rowans Chapel slayings entered local legend, but never accurately. The official version remained fixed: civilized preacher murdered by savage slave, tragic example of misplaced Christian charity, proof that the institution of slavery was necessary to control inherently violent natures. This version appeared in newspapers, in legal proceedings, in historical accounts written by those who benefited from the system and saw no reason to question its justifications.